Firstly, I'd like to thank the Institute of Art History for its kind invitation to speak to you today, and for the help of Katerina Mastorova and Petra and others, such as Lucy Highlandova and Radim Vondracek, in making it happen. While my paper is heavily focused on activities in the United Kingdom and France during the 1840s, I believe that the framework, the structure I have used is generic and is just as applicable to Prague as to London or Paris. My aim is to show that by 1839, there was a large and mature printing and reprographics industry across the industrialized world. That soon after the announcements of Daguerre and Fox Talbot, who I'll call Talbot because that's how he was named himself, there were several attempts in 1839 to create a photomechanical process. There were a variety of reasons why photomechanical processes did not become widely used during the 1840s, but that the experience of printers and those employed in the reprographics industries before 1839 and the arrival of photography played a very important role in developing photomechanical processes in the 1850s, so about 10 years after the announcements of Daguerre and Fox Talbot. Here we have a representative sample of influential histories of photography. Few have made a comprehensive effort to establish the interrelationship between the contemporary printing and reprographics trades and that of the early years of photography. Josef Maria Eder in the top corner there is perhaps an exception with his Geschichte. He was the head of a graphics institute, but he was also only one generation away from the early inventors. The other histories that I've put up there are the results of really the practical and logistics of researching in the analog world. These historians primarily used published journals and some newspapers to assemble their histories. Their focus was almost exclusively on photography. Today, in the digital information age, we provided with historians a vast increase in resources: online searchable digitized books, scholarly journals, and newspapers have proliferated. Perhaps the most significant resources are the correspondence of leading figures, such as those of William Henry Fox Talbot. This is just one of the significant contributions made by Larry Scharf to Talbot studies. One aspect of scholarly research I'm trying to help fill, and I'm trying to be a bit provocative to get people to respond to these ideas, is that there are comparative scholarly short-sightedness of historians of printing and historians of photography to develop an integrated view of printing and photography during the 1840s. For decades, these academic disciplines have existed in parallel with comparatively little integration. Nevertheless, there is a movement amongst a small band of contemporary photographic historians, Petra is one of them, of the first decades of photography to examine the interrelationship with contemporary printing processes. Bilder for Jedermann and the Image Multiplied, both from the 1980s, shows you how old I am, inspired my doctoral research. Anthony Griffith's 2016 study, The Print Before Photography, has a single page of text on photography and was another stimulus for me to delve into the 1840s and its predecessors of the 1820s and 1830s. Much of my thinking and research for this lecture has been influenced by Michael Twyman. He has been publishing important and groundbreaking studies on printing, lithography, and chromolithography since 1970. What Michael has very patiently explained to me is that direct transfer lithography from a paper original was already well established in France and other countries by the 1820s, so almost 20 years before photography. So my question is, why wasn't photolithography invented earlier? Well, I hope to show that it was, but for a variety of reasons, it never took off. My presentation examines how the photographic processes of Daguerre and Talbot, which were announced in January 1839, impacted reprographics during the 1840s. I'll make some observations on each process and finish with a short case study of how experience of pre-photographic printing processes was crucial to the development of one photomechanical process, that of photozincography, that is using zinc plates for the matrix to print from. However, to start with, we need to consider the state of reprographics in 1839. I'm not going to read this list out, but here are the types of printing organizations that existed and would exploit photographic illustration during the second half of the 19th century. They include state or public sector, as well as commercial printers. What we will see is that few have been found to have experimented with photography to any significant degree during the 1840s. What is also important to underline is that many printers were what we call in English jobbing printers. Their business was to provide small print runs of what we today call ephemera, letterheads, tickets, bills, etc. Let's now look at the scale of reprographic processes available during the period we're examining. While these two publications are dated to 1859, they indicate the scale of the number of existing reprographic processes active by the time of the 1840s, and also the number of UK patents, here on the right, relating to printing. It's important to underline that while the book on the right hand refers to specifications relating to printing, it does not include a number of relevant patents that are photographic in nature. So we can see here 156 reprographic processes. Everybody invented one. It could be the Hamber type, the Trinkovar type, the Matareva type, everything like that. Over here, between 1830 and 1850, on the patent side, only 5 are photographic, and they miss some. And we can show this by an 1861 publication on specifications for photography. So there are 11 recorded patents related in this period, 1839 to 1850, and 2 of them are particularly important. The first is Talbot's, which included reference to photographic prints being used for illustration in publications. And the second one is Antoine Claudet's patent for Fizeau's photomechanical process to etch and print from daguerreotype plates. So one is paper photography, the other one is etching and printing from a metal plate. It's relevant that neither of these appeared in the patent specific to printing that we saw previously on the previous slide. I think it'd be helpful to consider some of the barriers facing the adoption of photography by the printing and reprographics trades during the 1840s. Many years ago, I became aware of the IPM FUD marketing methodology. That is fear, uncertainty, and doubt, i.e. always by IBM. So fear is what might happen, uncertainty of exactly the impact, and doubt that the technology of other people would work. So this model is just as applicable in the 1840s, but I've added some relevant dimensions that I'll go through. So from the top, there's just a lack of understanding. What on earth are they talking about? Then there's the economic dimensions of the existing commercial market. Was there a recession where people buying lots of prints? There's protecting an existing market share. We shouldn't underestimate what dirty tricks would go on. There's balancing the push of technology, the new printing photographic processes, with the pull of the market wanting to buy photographs and photomechanical prints. There's a lack of printers to expand their services. there's a lack of available funds. They couldn't get the money to invest in the new technology. And then something that several people who are working in this area, such as Martin Jürgens, struggling to get the process to work consistently. So let's go and have a look at Senefelder. So he was born here in Prague in 1771, and his process, lithography, was the most prominent reprographic process in the 1830s and 40s. He developed this and published it in the late 1790s. And what's significant from my viewpoint, and Michael Twyman underlined this, Senefelder refers to transfer lithography. Here is an image on a piece of paper, and I can chemically treat it and get it onto a lithographic stone. And we'll return to this method later. Here is a map created by Michael Twyman some years ago. It shows really the linguistic barriers. So French and German, so there's a big and a bit of Italian, but over on this side is a blank. And in red, I've put down a number of early lithographers in Prague that Lucy Highlandover has kindly shared with me. It's claimed that Cronenbold at the top in 1810 was active as a lithographer, though Lucy's told me that he probably was a print seller selling lithographs rather than actually producing themselves. The success of these lithography printers, Michael Twyman claims that owed considerably to almost entirely to ephemera, small-scale printing of ephemera. And among them was the transfer lithography process. So here in Bohemia, these two publications, and I thank Radim Vondracek for these are the two directories, one on the left 1840 and here on the right 1842, that you can make a list of all the lithographers in Bohemia, Moravia, Prague. So this is a sort of a starting point. I haven't done it, but this is how you could find out how many there were and where they were geographically distributed. So in Paris, the most successful and most prominent lithographer was Joseph Lemercier. And he had a very large, by the 1830s, a very large printing works. He won numerous prizes during the period in Paris, 1839, 1844, 1849. These were industrial exhibitions held in Paris. And it was interesting that it wasn't until 1848 that he became interested and started experimenting in photolithography. Here is just a view of his lithographic company. There are up to 30 presses working here. And down the side, these are the stones, the lithographic stones that were brought out to print. So this is 1846, a massive industry. But I still wonder why he didn't look at photolithography earlier than 1848. Now here, again, this is another map from Michael Twyman. So this is from a directory of London lithographic printers from 1800 to 1850. And you can see here, this is the River Thames, and you can see how many there were just in this tiny area of London in that period, 1801 to 1850. So if we go into a bit more detail, on the right, we've got this directory of printers. And so there are 1,709 printers or reprographic houses active between 1830 and 1850. There were only 9 photographers, commercial photographers, that were active in the same period. Another important consideration is that by 1840, and it's the same, I think, in many industrialized countries, the British printing industry were large and relatively mature, and they also had professional bodies. So here we have a union for the London Union for Compositors, and also here in September 1840, the first issue of their journal, or the commercial publication, the Compositor's Chronicle. These also included apprenticeships and formal training. There was a professional press. And I'm just underlining how mature printing and reprographics was by the time photography was announced. Here we have an example of another professional publication, La Lithographe. It was published first in 1838. And these are the kind of samples that were in here. I point out particularly to this down here, these are pieces of ephemera that Michael Twyman wants to underline. That's where they made the money. But one thing the photography couldn't handle was colour. So in 1837, Godefroy Engelmann published his album Chromolithomatique in 1837, as you can see here. This was very influential. And here on the right, we have a hand-coloured daguerreotype. It's probably the late 1840s. But a lot of the miniature painters, again, under the FUD factor, worrying about what was going to happen, they turned themselves into painters of daguerreotypes. So you paid extra money and a commercial artist would paint. And some of these are really stunning. They do look like, to our eye, colour photographs. So if we move on to the daguerreotype, let's just have a look now at the beginnings of this. The daguerreotype process was announced at a meeting of the French Academy of Sciences on the 7th of January, 1839. This was an oral presentation by François Arago, the secretary of the Academy. There were no specimen daguerreotypes on display. However, before this meeting, several members of the Academy had already seen samples of daguerreotypes and been very impressed. Daguerre was an astute commercial businessman and marketeer, and was strategic in his international distribution of sample daguerreotypes. One of these was to Clemens von Metternich, whose house was, and excuse my bad pronunciation, Kniswart. Here just if I get out of the way, west of Prague. That daguerreotype is in the Technical Museum here, and if you haven't seen it, do go and see it, because I did it this morning. It's got this most fantastic frame around it, and my goodness, it would have taken a big box to ship to Metternich. But Daguerre also gave examples to the Austrian ambassador in Paris, Anton Graf Apponyi. He also gave samples to Austrian Emperor Ferdinand I, Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia, Ludwig I of Bavaria, Leopold I of Belgium, and Tsar Nicholas I of Russia. And I discovered recently, Daguerre offered to send a sample daguerreotype to Queen Victoria, but she declined, stating that the protocol was that, as general rule, she did not accept presents from foreign individuals. Anyway, moving on. News of the announcement was soon recorded in a number of publications across Europe. These included Dingler's Journal in German-speaking countries, the Athenaeum in the United Kingdom, and you could write a pretty comprehensive history of early photography just from the columns of the Athenaeum. There were also formal publications of the French Academy of Sciences, etc., and also influential daily newspapers, such as the Journal des Débats. However, if you go onto Google and you type in Daguerre 1839, it's absolutely astounding how many journals were mentioning it. Sometimes they are copying, they're syndicated, so they'll take something out of the Concours and just publish it locally. Also, these were distributed across Europe, these journals. So here in Prague, on January the 27th, 1839, The German language newspaper Bohemia included a short article on the daguerreotype. The Wiener Zeitung was another channel that disseminated information on photography. Another newspaper that disseminated knowledge was the Brunner Zeitung. And by mid-October 1839, 2 bookshops in Prague had sampled daguerreotypes on display in their windows. These may have been made by the circle of Georg Gropius, a Berlin bookseller. In May 1839, this journal, the Innerösterreicher Industrie- und Gewerbeblatt, began publication. The editor was Karl von Frankenstein, who was an electroplater by profession. Now, electroplating became a central process in making daguerreotypes. It was the way of putting a silver coating onto a daguerreotype plate. And on the right here, if I get back out of the way, we have an 1843 manual that actually is a double manual. It has both instructions by an English guy called Smee on Gewaldenpastille, electrotyping, but also a daguerreotype manual. In February 1839, Charles Wheatstone, another scientist in Talbot Circle, informed him of the experiments of Ferdinand Hessler, Prague, on the action of the spectrum of chloride of silver that varies with the substance employed for the prism used to split the light source. In the Jahrbuch für Fabrikanten und Gewerbegetrieben in the year 1840, Hessler published a technical description of the daguerreotype. Now, Petra has been helping me trying to unpick this. When Hessler made his first daguerreotypes is a bit unclear, but one published source states that he took several in May 1840, and in the autumn of 1839, he may already have been practicing to make daguerreotypes. Now, Hessler in 1840 went on an extended professional study trip. He visited Germany, Belgium, France, and England. But we've yet to establish who he met, particularly from my perspective in England. By 1841, daguerreotype portraits were being taken all over the industrialized world, including Wilhelm Horn's studio here in Prague. One of his earliest trainees was Bertha Beckmann, who trained in Prague in 1842 and moved to Leipzig, where, together with her husband, Edward Wehnert, she opened a photographic studio in 1843. She then moved to New York in 1849 before returning to Germany in 1851. On the way back to Germany, she visited the International Exhibition in the so-called Crystal Palace in London's Hyde Park, and she was apparently widely influenced by the photographs on display there. I particularly like this striking portrait of Anton Gindley, the Bishop of Brno, taken by Friedrich Franz, a Premonstratensian professor of physics at the local philosophy school. And this was taken in the same year that Wilhelm Horn opened his daguerreotype studio in Prague. And I think this is really important. This is another illustration from one of Petra's publications. But this sort of shows that in any large city in the industrialized world, there were photographers at work. Now, this is quite a detailed slide, but what I wanted to show here was the timeline from 1839, from January to December. So if we start off at the top, Arago presents on the 7th of January. He then goes to another establishment and reports again. By July, exhibits are being shown. And then Daguerre all along wanted to sell his process. So by August, he'd sold his process and got a big pension. And then in September, the first manual appears. This is important and we'll come back. By the 23rd of September, Donner is already exhibiting photomechanical prints. September 1839. And then he exhibits further on the 14th of October, 14th of October. Now, if we compare that, daguerreotype is a bon viveur, he's a showman, and he's a businessman. Talbot is a landed gentleman. He didn't have to work. He was a scientist. So he gets spooked, as we say, by Daguerre. So he rushes out through his friend Faraday and presents samples on the 25th of January, a couple of weeks later. And then on the 31st, there are more shown at another institution. Talbot then publishes, we can see down the bottom, his account of photogenic drawing, his first photographic process. And then in August, he exhibits 93 samples at the very influential British Association for the Advancement of Science that held an annual meeting. This one was in Birmingham. But then, as far as I can see, he didn't do very much after that. Right, here, this is Martin Jurgens has kindly allowed me to show you this slide. I'm not going to go through all the names. The point to take away here is that there are two different processes going on here. At the bottom, in the green, we've got those who are trying to etch the daguerreotype plates to produce a printing matrix that you could ink up and print from. Up at the top, electrotyping is another process related to it. And you can see there's quite a flurry of activity in the 1840s, and then it tails off. So here we have, on the 23rd of September, 1839, Alfred Donny's first plates and prints, including this bust of Dionysus or Antinous. So a photogravure, and it's now in the New York Public Library. So you can see that within months, people were already producing photomechanical prints. But look at the image quality, okay, because we'll come back to that. So here's an example of electroplating. Okay, so what we're doing is mating a copy, and you can see it's reversed. So this has been attributed to Hippolyte Fizeau, who we'll come back to, and Léon Foucault in the early 1840s. It's an example in the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York. But you can see here, constantly think about image quality. The metrics we use today, and you'll see that people were talking about that then. Now, this is a plate from La Lithographe, which had started publication in 1838. And we have here a particularly interesting lithograph, because this was published in December 1839 in La Lithographe. And it's a drawn copy by Louis Marquier of a daguerreotype by Daguerre himself. And down, it says that down in the bottom corner and here as well. Okay, so it's after a daguerreotype now lost of the east end of Notre Dame. And it was lithographed by the editor of Le Lithographe, Jules Desport. This is a frequently reproduced cartoon, a lithograph by Maurice, say, of the fear of the impact of the daguerreotype. And this was published in La Caricature in December 1839. So everything is to do with the daguerreotype. The train is made out of cameras, and I want to go to two particular components. On the left is a rather sort of macabre view of what was going to happen to engravers. Anyway, so on the right is something of interest. So it talks here about Dr. Donnet, and we saw one of his illustrations. Now, I got confused when I first got into photo history. What are they talking about? A preuve daguerréenne sur papier, isn't it, on a metal plate? So I think that a lot of people who saw this really wouldn't have understood this at all, because they would have heard of Daguerre and the metal plate, but they would have been less aware that somebody was trying to make paper prints from engraved plates. Now, one of those who disseminated knowledge of the daguerreotype was Joseph Hamel, who was a member of the Russian Imperial Academy of Sciences, and he traveled around Europe reporting back on scientific developments to the Academy in St. Petersburg. While he was in London in April 1839, Hamel made many considerable efforts to meet with Talbot. Unable to do so, he met Talbot's mother, who gave him a number of specimens of photogenic drawing. In a detailed letter to the Imperial Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg, Hamel included a number of those and some of Donné's heliogravure process. And this letter was read to the Imperial Academy on the 10th of January 1840. So you can see this network, examples going all over the developed parts of Europe. Now, let's look at the introduction of electrotyping. In 1837, Moritz Jacobi had perfected his electrotyping or galvanoplastique process, and he published this in German in 1840, and it was translated into English in 1841. Now, Jacobi had undertaken a significant amount of his research at the University of Tartu in Estonia, my mother's hometown, before being called to St. Petersburg. So I think there's quite a good case that he actually invented it in Tartu and was, or Dorpat as it was called in German. So Moritz's Jacobi's process offered a solution to create duplicate printing matrices from engraved or etched daguerreotype plates. So if we go back to the Athenaeum, one of the most influential journals, as early as May 1839, this journal alluded to the potential future combination of the new photographic processes of Daguerre and Talbot with Jacobi's invention. It appears that Professor Jacobi in St. Petersburg has also made a discovery which promises to be of little less importance to the arts. In 1842, Julius Bachmann, a contributor to the Allgemeines Wiener Polytechnisches Journal, considered that the daguerreotype and electrotyping were Milchschwester, twin technologies. A central point to underline is that those involved in developing photomechanical processes around 1840 were not printers or part of the reprographics trade. They were primarily scientists. While Donné appears to have worked independently, others did collaborate with contemporary printers. During 1840 in Vienna, Joseph Beres, who was an anatomist, worked with a local printer named Joseph Axmann. And here we have Hippolyte Fizeau. He worked with a number of engravers to develop his process, including Johann Hurlimann, Auguste François Lemaître, and Louis-André Brevière. And he, Fizeau, presented his process to the Academy of Science in May 1841, a photomechanical. The point I want to make here is, look at Joseph Beres's dates. He died in 1844. So that's a rather macabre reason that things didn't progress. But he did mark it. He had a colleague, an English colleague, who another doctor who did a lot of work in the UK sharing his process. But what Beres did publish was a 4-page booklet titled Phototype. And this was issued in August 1840. Included both views from nature, and this is important, as well as works of art. While today it is seen as a seminal publication, very few copies were issued, and of these, only 5 copies have been identified, and of the 5, only 3 actually located. So if we go back to Fizeau, here are the 2 photogravures by Fizeau, both portraits from life and dated to around 1841. They were probably from photographs taken by Leribor, and we'll come back to him in a minute. On the left is the portrait of the engraver Johann Hurlimann, and I discovered that he was quite famous because he had a wooden leg. And a lot of people mentioned that rather than his technical capabilities. But what I think is important to underline, and what I've done down the bottom, is that there was a problem with printing a full grayscale, and particularly with midtones. So they looked to the 21st century eye rather like poor photocopies. And this lack of halftones was noticed by many those observing these samples at the time. They can't reproduce halftones. So this publication, Excursion Daguerreenne, is significant in terms of a milestone in photographic illustration. It was published in parts between 1840 and 1844, and there were at least 112 illustrations. Now, these were almost all aquatints copied from original daguerreotypes. And there was a suggestion that the actual total number of daguerreotypes taken for this publication was 1,000 from all over the world. Now, some of these, the daguerreotypes, were actually sold by Antoine Claudet in London, and he also was selling copies of the Excursion Daguerreenne. Now, 3 of these illustrations were photo engravings by Fizeau's process. Here's one, and it's very nice because they put down the credits that this is by Lerebourg, and it says here, Clavé par le procédé Fizeau. It's a topographical view of the Hôtel de Ville in Paris. This is dated of the East End exterior of Notre Dame. It's after the life of the Virgin Mary. But in 1853, a decade after it was published, Talbot provided an insight into the practical reality of activities during the 1840s, when he specifically wrote of Fizeau's early photomechanical process. Quote, "Its use has been discontinued owing to the great uncertainties which attended it and wearied the patience of the experimenters." So it was very difficult to get good results consistently. However, as Martin Jurgens has kindly shared with me, one of the reasons for only 3 appearing appears to be legal. On the 2nd of November 1843, Fizeau, here on the right, signed a legal document to transfer the rights to his process to Lerebourg on the left. However, there were a number of restrictions. The first was geographic. The rights to the process were only for the Department of the Seine, that is Paris and its environs. And the other condition referred to the continuation of the publishing of Excursion Daguerreenne. However, this was restricted to an agreed upon format, size, and to no more than 24 prints per year. And I think Martin as well, not too sure exactly what that meant. But coupled to the issues relating to the commercial viability of continuing to issue Excursion Daguerreenne, these contractual conditions are likely to be reasons why no more illustrations by the Fizeau process were issued as part of that publication. So we've got a couple of reasons why things didn't progress. So let's go on now to Talbot. Now, we're fortunate that we have 2 online resources for Talbot, both created by Larry Scharf. At the top is the correspondence, about 9,000 identified letters by him, to and from him, and also the catalogue raisonné of his photographs. Now, in addition, and I was saying this to Petra yesterday, is this book, Records of the Dawn of Photography, and these are the notebooks transcribed by Larry Scharf, probably about 25 years ago now. Now, these notebooks that I went through as part of the research for this lecture just showed how much activity Talbot was involved in all types of reprographic processes. He was trying to engrave daguerreotypes, he was playing around with lithography, he was trying transfer lithography, you name it. So it's the inquiring mind of a scientist. He wasn't trying to commercialize them. But he was more than aware of photolithographic prints from his calotype prints. So that's his first one, the photogenic drawing, was a direct image on a piece of paper. And he then discovered there's what's called the latent image, the negative, and that he could print from the negative. So he was aware that producing a photolithographic process from his the negative positive process was quite possible. And he was also aware of Fizeau's work, as we've seen, from at least May 1841. So Talbot's announcement, as we saw from that timeline, he got his friend, the scientist Michael Faraday, to take samples of this photogenic drawing. And here are some of the types that he would have had. They're all contact prints, although this is a view of his home, Laycock Abbey. Faraday had very popular open lectures on a Friday evening. And on the 25th of January, 1839, he mentioned that these samples were on display in the institution's library after the lecture and encouraged people to go and have a look at them. So 1 week later, on the 31st of January, Talbot's paper on, quote, some account of the art of photogenic drawing was read at the prestigious Royal Society. And here is the original text that they still hold, the manuscript. Now, Talbot didn't actually read the paper himself because these scholarly societies got the secretary of the society to read out the presentation. I'm not even sure that Talbot was even in the room. There is his publication. It didn't have any illustrations in it. And again, I'm just showing the kind of samples that he'll be talking about. So another aspect of dissemination, I'm using Michael Faraday as an example. So I've gone through the published letters of Faraday and some other sources, and I've plotted here where he was a member, an honorary member of scholarly societies in red, and the location of known correspondence between 1832 to 1840. It's quite geographic, it's most spread up to St. Petersburg, but Petra was telling me yesterday that there are examples of contemporaries in Vienna saying, we're not listened to, we're not part of the community. So I'd be very interested in what's happening, the connections that they've got here. I can tell you that if I put a map up of Talbot's collections, it would have been much more detailed than this from his 9,000 letters. So one company, just very close to where the announcements were made on the Strand, in the building for the Royal Society, etc., was called Ackermann. And in April 1839, Ackermann published Ackermann's Photogenic Drawing Apparatus in the middle. Now, this is an 8-page pamphlet, and it's really the first photographic instruction book. Now, it was accompanied with a box of paper, a printing frame, and chemicals for making photogenic drawings through contact printing. There was no camera. So you had paper, chemicals, printing frame, took your object, a print, contacted it, whatever, away you go. But also, this is the very famous pencil of nature. And Thomas Longman, who's the publisher, you can see down here, in July 1844, he was walking past Ackermann's shop, the repository of arts you can see there, and actually sent a letter to Talbot saying that he'd seen in the window part one of, this was 24th of June, 1844, he'd seen part one advertised in the window, which is just an interesting tidbit in terms of how it was presented to the public. Right, now, what I want to believe people to understand is that I believe that Talbot was trying at a very early date to see if his process could be exploited to produce a half-tone screen made up of dots of ink in different sizes. And this is why he's folded the lace in that way. So he's got on the right-hand side very small areas, squares of lace, but by turning it over on itself, he's made even smaller dots. Okay, so bear with me. He did a lot of these lace diagram images, but this one is particularly important because he's trying to get the dots smaller and smaller. Now, Talbot's library in Laycock held a wide range of visual material, including engravings and lithographs. Now, I believe that from the previous slide, and another one I'm going to show you, he was trying to mimic the optical effect of stipple engraving, where the dots, when you go further away, actually look as a continuous tone. And he would have had stipple engravings like this, but he certainly would have had this one on the left-hand side, because this is an engraving that was included in the Art Union Monthly Journal for March 1846. And a couple of months later, in June, Talbot issued a photographic print as a freebie. And you can see here what's quite interesting on this. This is the Bridget Orleans, and he had a big problem producing enough prints for the Art Union. And what's happened here is that it was issued on this card in a brown paper envelope with the title on it. And I've come across several instances where the owner has cut out and pasted underneath the title. So that is not part of the original publication. That's a cutout from the envelope that it came in. Now, this image is another important one. It's very difficult to see, and I've tried to sharpen it up. This is a double exposure of a piece of lace over a square negative of an engraving. And I again think he again is trying to break it up into dots. So it could be like a stipple engraved reproduction. But these are hypotheses, and there are people online who probably are going to come back to me and say, load of rubbish, you're mad. But anyway, this again shows you the kind of reproductions he was making. These are all lithographs from his collection, and they're quite interesting because of the spread. You've got Dürer's portrait of Christ, you've got caricatures, you've got Spanish scenes, etc. And then this is sort of a very contemporary, a touching view of some of the ins and outs of this world. So he was interested, but I don't understand why he spent, I mean, there are hundreds of these lithographs that he photographed. I'm not sure why. Right, this is his mother. I call her the head of marketing because she really went for it, as I mentioned earlier with Hammer. She was handing out samples the whole time. She was constantly chivvying her son, saying, you must, get preeminence for your process. You are the star, etc., etc. So she's a pushy mum. So, as I've said, that she sent 4 samples of photogenic drawings to Metternich. And he had subsequently at least 33 photogenic drawings. This is Metternich in his collection, 33 photogenic drawings and calotype specimens. But if you go through the correspondence between his mother and the son, it's a fascinating insight into what was happening. Now, the point I want to underline here is in the 1840s, these are the 4 major publications that Talbot helped produce that were photographically illustrated. So we've seen the June, the Art Union, and they were all different photographs. We started off with the Pencil of Nature you've seen. Then there are some pictures in Scotland of 1845. And then this is the first art history book illustrated with photographs. These are the Annals of the Artists of Spain, a special presentation copy, 1847-48. The point I want to underline is that he persisted in producing salted paper individual photographs and having them pasted in. But he must have known that photomechanical was quite possible. But his mother and he decided, I've invented this photography, paper photography. I'm going to push it as all that I can. I'm going to ignore some of the technical capability. And here you see exactly how they were produced. So this is one half of a panorama of the establishment in Reading that he set up for his manservant, Henneman, to open up a commercial photographic studio. So this boy is the printer. So all prints were handmade using sunlight in the frames, all contact printed. But you can see that it was liable to produce faulty copies. And this was a slip that he put in this instance, was into the Annals of the Artists of Spain. And so it reads, the faulty impressions in this volume may be exchanged for others on application. Mr. Henneman, and he moved to Regent Street by that in London. So the reason for that is that the prints faded, they were determined on sunlight, etc., and also the purity of the water or the lack of it in Reading didn't help. So photomechanical could have removed these, but printing and pasting in was the way, the truth, and the light. So Antoine Claudet was a very important figure in early photography. So he was French-born, and you can see from here that in 1839 he actually trained with Daguerre. So Daguerre trained him on his process, and then he purchased for £200 a license to be a commercial daguerreotype photographer in London. England and Wales were the only countries in the world where there was a patent. I mentioned to you earlier the pension that Daguerre got. In England, you still had to pay to be a commercial photographer. So as I said, he was selling excursions daguerreennes as well as daguerreotypes. In 1841, he opens his studio, and he's offering to make electrotype copies of daguerreotypes by September 1841. By 1843, as we've seen, he co-patents the photomechanical process. In 1844, he takes out a license for the calotype. In 1845, he exhibits 6 photogravures, photomechanical prints, by Fizeau at the British Association of the Advancement of Science, held at their conference in Cambridge that year. So I'm now going to look briefly at 3 inventors who in the early 1840s created probably the earliest photolithographic processes. None of these photolithographic processes became commercially successful, and the reasons why are common stories to be found with the introduction of new technologies. So the first example is Joseph Dixon. Now, he wasn't a printer, he was an entrepreneurial inventor. And perhaps his most notable invention was the first wood and graphite pencil to be sold in the USA. However, in 1840, he experimented with the daguerreotype process and was one of the first to take photographic camera portraits. Now, the source for most of this is the Scientific American from 1854. And he says, in some few trials I made in the above period, i.e. 1840, I had very hopeful results, but various other things of more immediate importance occupied my attention, and requiring all my time, I laid this subject by until a more convenient season, which has not yet arrived. So what was he talking about? Well, he was talking about actually capturing a photographic image on a lithographic stone. So he coated the stone with a photosensitive emulsion. He put it into the back of a camera, and he made an image on the stone. But he then had to convert that to form a matrix to be able to print from it, and he worked out how to do that. But as you can see, this is an example of, I've got bigger fish to fry, more money to make elsewhere, so it goes into the background. But he was a successful businessman. Now, the next guy is a Frenchman called Zercher, and very little is known about him, other than his process was invented around 1842. Now, these are 2 examples. They were copies of drawings by the French illustrator Paul Gavarni, and I'm not sure exactly where they appeared originally. But I want to point out that this is line art, artwork. This is not views from nature. And it's much easier to reproduce line art than a view from nature. Now, Zirka was acknowledged as one of the earliest histories of photolithography, published in 1870. Now, the author, Fortier, explained why Zirka was unable to exploit his process, and these were both technical and economic. Firstly, his process was time-consuming, showed no great benefit to the existing reprographics trade, and in addition could not reproduce half-tones. These resulted in him giving up his experiments with photolithography. And the second reason was Zirka was not a wealthy man and had a family to support. He lacked the financial backing to continue to develop his process and therefore gave up. An important scientific figure in England during the 1840s was this man, Robert Hunt. He published in 1841 the first English language manual on photography that included a section on the history of the medium. And down the bottom, I've got here that multiplication of pictures from an original photograph is the great end of the art. So he was interested in reproduction. He had experimented with daguerreotype plates, trying to print from them. And he'd also been interested in adapting lithography. Now, in the letters between Hunt and Talbot during 1842, Hunt confirmed that he'd been sent by a lithographic process, prints by a lithographic process developed by a printer then in Liverpool, one of the major ports in England, by the name of Lewis. So the third case is Joseph Lewis, and he provided another set of considerations. Around 1841, he was only 20 years old, and he took a photographic camera and created a glass plate negative of this church, St. George's, Everton, Liverpool. If this negative survives, it's yet to be located. But the fact that he's using a glass plate rather than paper for his negative is significant. However, both the inventors of photography, Daguerre and Talbot, also experimented with glass plates to support for their photographic images. So here we have two samples of his photolithographic process, and he's kindly put down in the caption that he made them in August 1842. And here we are. These are in the Museum of the History of Science. And the reason they're there is because they're part of the John Herschel collection. And Lewis sent these samples to Hunt, who then sent them on to Herschel. So Lewis spent much of his professional life in Dublin, and he, as we say in England, banged on about the fact that he was the inventor of photolithography. He got several patents, etc., etc. But he did also in 1861, another date was saying, I first invented this. And again, just to underline the knowledge network. So Lewis here communicates with Robert Hunt, who also communicates with William Vaux Talbot, and he also goes to John Herschel, and Herschel had visited Daguerre in Paris. So there's a lot of interrelated networks there, and they're all scientists, except of course Lewis, who's a commercial printer, and Daguerre, who's, well, Daguerre. Right, so I just want to finish off with an example of Rudolf Appel. Now, he was born in Nysa in Silesia, now in Poland, not that too far away from Prague. This portrait may be of him, taken from a group portrait I'll show you later. So from around 1834, Appel worked for a printer named Baldemus, firstly in Erfurt and then in Berlin. Now, Baldemus developed a version of transfer lithography. Remember, at this date, it was already well established. This included using either freshly drawn graphics on paper or using an old document that needed to be chemically treated in order to transfer to a lithographic stone, in many respects destroying it. But it would loosen up the ink in an old document. So Baldemus came to a business arrangement with Carl Siemens and his brother, and together with a Berlin clocksmith, they designed a printing press for Baldemus's process. News of the Baldemus process was established in London in December 1841. And in May 1844, a couple of years later, Appel travelled to England with Siemens in order to set up and operate a printing press that was going to use this process. Now, although it's called anastatic printing, that name was given to it by the brother of the English patentee. Because he was German, Siemens couldn't register a patent, so he had to find a friendly Englishman. And the friendly Englishman's brother said, "Oh, why don't we call it anastatic printing?" And if you go into this is something that Michael Twyman told me, people knew straight away, this is a complete con. It's just transfer lithography. Anyway, so anastatic printing, including presses, was licensed to a number of commercial printers and public sector organisations, including the British Army. But Siemens Printing Company failed. He closed it down and gave Appel the rights to the process. Appel moved to Ipswich in the east of England, where another printer named Cowell had also taken out a licence. Here on the left is a manual by Cowell. Here on the right is a map of Ipswich printed by Appel by the anastatic process. He didn't last long in Ipswich, and he came back and set up here as a view of his works in Gerrard Street in London, Soho. And I can read it here, but it says Rudolf Appel, patentee anastatic appelotype. So he'd actually changed it to his name. But also he's an engraver, he'd do lots of other things as well as anastatic appelotype printing. One of the things that he did was that he reproduced documents for probably the greatest bibliographer of all time, Sir Thomas Phillips. Thomas Phillips, if it didn't move, he bought it, right? And this is how he'd store stuff. Over here, we just got one example of a monument to Richard Giel, who died in 1608. So again, this is line art. It's comparatively simple to reproduce. Mindful of the time. Right, so photozincography. So in 1857, Appel's business went bankrupt. He failed. He had owed lots of money, but he was employed at the Ordnance Survey. That's the UK's mapping agency in Southampton by the head of the agency, Henry James. And Henry James, although he always credited it, he invented photozincography. In fact, it was a joint effort with some of his other colleagues, and also Appel, who arrived in 1848. By 1859, they produced the first photozincographic prints. This is a manual from 1860 with Henry James's name on it, but Captain Scott, this is a second edition from 1863. He was one of the main protagonists and inventors. But what note here that neither of these are official British government publications. So I just want to show you how the process flow works and where Appel was able to influence. So you've got here the original document. So you then have to create a very, very specific type of negative. And Appel was able to work on that. From that, you have to make a very, very specific black and white print. And that, again, is Appel saying, you've got to create a print like that so that I can then put it onto a zinc plate. And from the zinc plate, I can produce the facsimile. The facsimile actually has hand colouring in it. But this is what I say is Appel's value. He knew how to create the right negative, create the right paper print, get it onto the zinc plate and print it. And here we've got one of the photographers photographing one of the pages of the Domesday Book, which was one of the major publications. This is the 11th century sort of index of who owned what land in the country, William the Conqueror. And you can see here the military guy, a sapper, as they called, he's photographing an original page, 11th century page, to make a one-to-one copy, okay, on the negative in the back here. Right, so here we are. This is a sort of a family day out. I don't know, I've spent years and asked anybody called Appel in Southampton whether they are related. And I think that's him. I don't know. He's about the right age. He died aged 81 in the 1890s. 1898, he was 82. So I'm still looking for that, but it's quite a sweet shot, I think, of probably an open day where the kids turned up. So I just want to go some conclusions. I'm not going to read these all out. Okay, you can probably have a look, but it's just a recap. So already photography was coming into a very, very extensive reprographics printing world. The knowledge of Daguerre and Talbot's invention spread very, very rapidly. By the end of 1839, the 1840s, photomechanical processes were being invented. And they were being invented on metal plates, on glass, and on lithographic stone. The experimenters were usually scientists. But the point I want to raise is that the more we look into this, we may find evidence that some printers who weren't great academics might have had a go and given up, etc. There were legal, commercial, and personal issues why things didn't happen. There were technical and productivity issues to get it to work. And I do think image quality always counts. And if you go and look at the original sources and the commentary, they say it can't reproduce halftones and I can't get it to work consistently. Also, that the existing printing and reprographics industry was not ready for photomechanical. So that's my IBM FUD circle, as it were. And finally, the experience gained during the 1840s provided that fundamental experience for the gradual transformation of reprographics and photomechanical reprographics in the second half of the 19th century. And that's it. Thank you.